Hello and welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Donna Seymour. I'm a member of the St. Lawrence County branch of the American Association of University Women, one of the civic partners for this show. Today my guest is Sara Palmer. She's an organizer with the Restaurant Opportunities Center United, otherwise known as ROC, and she's working with tipped workers here in the North Country on the One Fair Wage campaign. Sara, welcome to North Country Matters. It's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so let's start out a little bit. Actually, Sara is originally from the Watertown area, so she knows the North Country, and now she's back working here as an organizer. Tell us a little bit about what ROC is and what they do, who they serve, and how they're making a difference for these tipped workers.
Absolutely. So ROC United is the first national restaurant worker organization. It was founded after September 11th, 2001, specifically in 2002, to help the displaced workers from the Windows on the World restaurant that was in the World Trade Center, as well as the families of the 73 members who lost their lives. ROC's mission is to work for wages and working conditions for restaurant workers. And right now, ROC is composed of 25,000 restaurant workers, over 300 high road employers, and thousands of consumers. They also offer job placement and training through their CHOW program, which is Colors Hospitality Opportunities for Workers, where they teach and train workers on front of the house and back of the house restaurant skills, and it's at no cost to employers or the employee. And currently we are working on the fight for one fair wage, which is to make sure that tipped workers are getting the full state minimum wage of $10.40 an hour plus their tips. Because right now the workers are making $7.50 an hour, and you know, we don't believe that's right.
Well, it's not a living wage, that's
No,
for
it's
sure.
not.
And we should tell people that there's over 14 million employees nationwide who work in this sector. It's one of our largest and fastest growing sectors. And it takes in a lot of money, so there's money to be shared equally with the people who are actually doing the work, if we can get to that point. You also work with Citizens Action, which is a grassroots membership organization that looks at many of the issues that are of concern to New Yorkers. Blue Carricker has been one of our guests on the show before talking about childcare. So how is Citizens Action involved in the tipped workers issue?
Well, Citizen Action of New York is involved in the tip workers issue because, as you know, we fight for social, racial, economic, environmental justice. And when the Fight for 15 went on, the whole sect of tipped workers was left out of that Fight for 15. So we're trying to bridge that gap so that the tipped workers are earning a living wage.
Right, and just for anybody who's not familiar with the Fight for 15, give us a quick tell us a little bit about what the Fight for 15 was about.
Yeah, the Fight for 15 was about the fast food workers and the low wages, and it's about making sure that they're given a living wage. Right. So that's been spread across the state of New York, where we're supposed to phase in eventually to $15 an hour.
Right, but like many of those kinds of reforms, it is so slow and so incremental that what you really need is the $15 up front, not after about 5 years, so that makes it tough. Let's remind folks who the tipped workers are and what a sub-minimum wage is and the history behind that, because that's really what we're talking about here, is the folks who aren't making the minimum wage, even as it's gradually increasing. They're still behind that curve, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. And the tipped workers are anyone that makes tips. You know, they are making the sub-minimum wage. The workers can be restaurant workers, valet parking employees, nail salons, and even some people in the hospitality industry. The sub-minimum wage is just to say what it is in New York State, it's $7.50 an hour. Federally, it's $2.13 an hour. And with the restaurant industry, there's a tip credit. So the tip credit of $2.90 is supposed to end up equaling the state minimum wage of $10.40. And the sub-minimum wage originated back when the slaves were newly freed, because the restaurant industry and the train industry did not want to pay the newly freed slaves a living wage. So they put them in establishments where they had to rely solely on tips as a source of income.
So that tells you how long this problem has been, and it is so well established now that people don't even know where it came from, and if they did, they might be rethinking it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and the other thing I think that people don't always understand is that there's the tipped workers. There's sort of the visible ones and the invisible ones, aren't there? They're the ones you see who maybe are mixing you a drink or serving your lunch. But then there's people in the back of the restaurant who are also tipped workers who no one sees, right?
Right, and that's one of the other issues is the, racial inequality and things like that, because they tend to put the pretty white woman in the front and then everyone else in the back.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another issue that, ROC United talks about and tries to uplift those types of situations, like the high road employers. It's definitely a problem.
Okay. So, unfortunately, just as we don't understand the history of all that, there's also a lot of misinformation that's out there about the One Fair Wage campaign and what the economics really are. There's a lot of pushback from certain employers every time we have a discussion about paying a living wage that, their businesses will close, they'll have to go into the poorhouse, and it turns out that those are not always true stories, are they?
No.
So,
yeah, the National Restaurant Association, one of the biggest lobbyist groups in the country, are basically behind the misinformation. They own Darden, which owns, Olive Garden, Red Lobster. They employ people at Disney. And so with their whole, our businesses are going to go under, we can't afford to do it. There are already 7 states in the country that implement One Fair Wage. They pay the state minimum wage, and the tipped workers still get tips. Those states are Alaska, Montana, Nevada, Minnesota, Oregon, California, and Washington. And what we found with those 7 states is that the profit margins have actually increased, as well as the wages of the workers and their tips. People are not stopping going out. Menu prices haven't changed, or barely at all. We're talking a matter of dimes. So
this is reallocating money that's already in the system, right?
Yes.
And making sure that these folks, these tipped workers, are getting their fair share. It isn't about costing the consumer a lot more to go to a restaurant to eat.
Right, and people are still going out to eat. I mean, because who really, if it is, the 10 cents difference or any change at all, who really notices, and is 10 cents going to stop someone from going out and experiencing the service of having someone wait on you? Because that's why people go out,
Right.
To have that experience.
Not to have to cook.
Right, exactly.
so exactly.
Yeah.
So there's that experience of those states. There's a new study that just came out that was a very wide-ranging study that looked at minimum wage workers and what happens when the minimum wage goes up. And there's absolutely no evidence that it hurts businesses. And in fact, it improves the lives of everybody who's involved in the thing. And it also is probably cheaper in the long run for the counties and the states, because their social service costs go down, because they're not having to figure out how to provide services that these workers can't buy themselves because they're being underpaid in their employment. So, it actually saves money up and down the line when it's more fair. Talk a little bit about why it's important for all workers to get the state minimum wage, and who suffers when they don't. How does that hurt? How does that hurt people? How does that hurt families? How does that hurt communities?
Yeah, so I think the good question is, why aren't all workers paid the state minimum wage? Because that's what we deemed in New York State, was that $10.40 an hour was the minimum for people to survive on. So the way that it hurts people by not being paid the full minimum wage is they are, like you said, relying on the system. They are relying on social programs, which is provided by the taxpayer. They are not able to afford their bills, and not able to get their kids maybe in the programs that they need, extracurricular activities.
I just saw a study not long ago about the minimum wage. There are there are no states where if you get minimum wage, you can usually afford to rent a place, because rent outpaces what the minimum wage allows you. So even though that we have a minimum wage, it doesn't mean that all sectors of New York State you can actually afford to live on that minimum wage. There are places where the cost of living is so much more than the average. So that's also a problem for folks. And then you've got issues like childcare. And a lot of these workers are not working during the daylight hours, so they've got to find somebody to watch their kids in the non-optimal hours when it comes to finding daycare. And there's lots of places like the North Country where you don't have daycare that isn't available to you in these evening hours or overnight if you've got a really late job, do you?
Right, and that's one of the things that I've been hearing from some of the restaurant workers that I've been talking to, is that they are not able to pick up the shifts when they would make the most in tips. So they're having to work until 4. And I've even had one worker tell me that she was thinking about going to a bank, even though she's worked at this particular establishment for a while, she's still not making ends meet. But then again, a lot of the workers have fallen into the, status quo. Well, that's just the way it is, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Right, and especially when we know there are states who have implemented the one fair wage and they're successful. Those are model states. Those are programs that we should be able to translate to states like New York very easily, because certainly California and Oregon and Washington, they're not that different from our state.
Right.
So those are good things. And this isn't just a state issue either. I mean, there's also a federal component to this. You mentioned how low the federal minimum wage is for these kinds of workers. It's a little over $2 an hour. And there's talk about from the Trump administration with getting rid of some of the protections that already exist in law for these tipped workers. And the one thing we know is that if there's tip stealing going on, when it's against the law, what happens when that law goes away?
Right, because that's one of the things under the Fair Labor Standards Act, is that the tips that the workers earn are their property. And the National Restaurant Association is trying to push the legislation through so that the employers can dip into the tips. And even the Department of Labor has found that 84% of the restaurant employers are falsifying or overestimating tips. I have spoken with restaurant workers who say they don't even look at their paycheck because their paycheck reads void on it, and they're only relying on tips when they go home. And these are one of the the bigger restaurant chains. So it's really
so this is something that's particularly for the big employers. They figured out all the ways to shortchange, quite literally, their workers, haven't they?
Right.
Yeah. It's not good. In New York State in the last few years has put a lot of resources into going after wage theft, employers who are actually guilty of wage theft. In fact, just quite recently, state investigators reported that they had recovered $35.3 million in 2017 alone. How does this play out for tipped workers? Is the state looking out for them as well? Is there a place for them to get redress from these kinds of programs?
I would say that's part of the reason why we're also having the hearings, is to hear about the workers' experiences and then, to empower them to come forward and speak up against the status quo, because that has been, unfortunately, a long-running theme in the restaurant industry. And like I said earlier, that's just the way it is. So it's about listening to their stories and then directing them to the appropriate people, like the Department of Labor, to review the reports.
Okay, so that's a good segue to the hearing that's coming up in Watertown on the 25th. Let's talk a little bit about the one wage hearing that will be in Watertown, and also how that plays into the hearings that are going around the state. What is expected to happen at those hearings? How can you testify? How can you support that process as a citizen?
Well, we have different opportunities for restaurant workers, restaurant owners, and then consumers to testify about their support or, of the one fair wage, talking about their experiences. It's going to be at 10 o'clock in the morning at the Dullea State Office Building. There's going to be a rally at 8:45 before, and a press conference. And we're just trying to turn out as many people as possible. And of course, the National Restaurant Association is also doing the same. So it's been a little bit of a battle, but I'm confident, we're all confident that we'll be able to do it. It's basically, you know, to Governor Cuomo's holding the hearings to, like I said, hear from the workers so that whether or not he's going to implement the one fair wage and make it law.
And this is one of several hearings that are being held around the state, correct? So this is the one for the North Country?
Yes,
right.
Yep. The first one's in Long Island, then Watertown, and then so on and so forth. So they are being held across the state.
And you've been up working with folks in this industry, encouraging them and preparing them to come to testify, I'm assuming. What kind of stories are you hearing?
Well, I'm hearing the stories, like I said, of people walking out without a paycheck, about hours being cut, not being able to get the shifts that they need to make the amount of money. Also, you know, with the sexual harassment in the industry, people that are having to rely on tips, having to, you know, not being empowered to speak up because they have to rely on those tips because they're not making enough with wages. Right,
and actually that is, that's all part of what's now being called the Me Too movement, but it's really, it's been a long-standing endemic problem in the restaurant and in the bar business, hasn't it? That you are at the mercy of the customer with no redress.
Exactly, and that's one of the things when I go around speaking to people is, you know, trying to put that into perspective for them. You know, imagine if it was your daughter, your granddaughter, or any other woman, you know, in this industry, and they come home and tell you, you know, oh, my boss said I have to wear a shorter skirt, or they have to dress a certain way, play a certain role, laugh off inappropriate comments because they're having to rely on it, the tips.
And if you tell the customer what you really think of his behavior, you're probably not going to get a big tip. So it's a real problem, isn't it?
Yes.
So hopefully then what will come out of these hearings is an understanding of what the scope of the problem is from the worker point of view, and maybe retire some of these myths that the industry likes to perpetuate about, you know, what one big happy family and everybody's well paid and don't worry about it kind of thing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's another story too, you know, with like, oh, we make enough money in the industry with tips. When I was at an establishment recently in Watertown, my waitress was only given a 21-cent tip. So that was based on the customer not liking the food, which was out of her control.
Right.
So there's things that are out of the waitress's control or the server's control where they're being penalized. So then she only made $7.71 that hour for that.
Right.
That's not the minimum wage.
No. And I think that points out a good point about how often that's the person who is seen as the only person that you can punish if you don't like what happened in that experience,
Right.
and that is something that as a waitress you have no control over. So that's a very good point. So do we have any idea what will happen after the hearings are done? Is there any timetable for making a decision, or how will all this information be gathered and processed?
We are hoping that once all of the hearings are done, the campaign and everything should run into June, and hopefully there will be a decision made by June based on the testimonies from the public.
Because is this going to be an executive action, or is it actually are there bills in front of the legislature to address this, or are you expecting this to be an executive action by the governor?
An executive action by the governor.
Okay, because June is when the legislative session ends, so.
Yes.
So if you don't have a decision by then and you're looking at a legislative remedy, it isn't going to happen.
Absolutely, and that's why it's such a time crunch right now.
Right.
You know, the hearings were just put up a matter of months ago, so everyone's been really working hard to try to get people to turn out for those hearings. So
how can the average person advocate? You know, maybe you're not in a position to go to a hearing, but how can you advocate for these folks? Who should you be contacting? Who should you be writing and you know, pushing forward for this one fair wage campaign?
I would definitely say write to Governor Cuomo to talk about why you support one fair wage or a living wage for tipped workers, and then also, if you cannot attend the hearing on the Department of Labor website, there is a place for registration where you can also submit a written testimony.
Oh, okay, good. So there is more than one way to get out the information and also to be a supportive person of that, because anybody who has, eaten out, it doesn't take very long before you recognize that these people work very, very hard and they're not taking home a big paycheck by any means. So yeah, it's we need to be sensitive to that and to say, well, here's actually something New York State can do, and we can help make that happen here in New York State with that kind of context. So thank you, Sarah. Anything else as we wrap up that you want to mention about in connection with this or other work that you're doing as an organizer?
Excuse me, yes. Well, I would just encourage anyone that's on the fence to look up ROC United, look up One Fair Wage.
We'll actually put that link in our show notes so people will know how to get to you folks.
Yes,
yeah.
And then in Albany County, we're working on paid sick days for everyone in the county. It was implemented in New York City. We're trying to implement it in Albany County in the legislature because we're finding, and this is also common for restaurant workers, a high percentage do not have paid sick days, and that's another issue where the restaurant workers are having to go in, prepare the foods while sick. Even if your family's sick, they're being retaliated against, hours cuts, maybe even losing the job. So that's another fight that I'm currently working on.
Yeah, and I was involved with the paid family leave that got passed last year in New York State, and so this is just the next step of that whole process, isn't it? Is to make sure that it goes from, instead of being just in municipalities and counties, but that also goes statewide at some point. And there's great reasons for that, public health wise, not to mention just in terms of how it's right to treat people. That's how you treat people anywhere. You should be treating people. So, Sarah, thank you for coming in today. It's been an interesting conversation. I hope people take advantage of this opportunity to do some supportive testimony, either in person at the hearing or, write to the governor or use the Department of Labor's website, because these are important things. This is a huge part of our population is involved in this industry. We all eat, so we're all involved in it as consumers in one way or another, and it's an important social and economic fairness issue, isn't it?
Absolutely.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our time is up. These conversations have been a production of North Country Matters, which is filmed here in the Fred W. Cleveland Computer Center of Potsdam Public Library. This show is a civic collaboration between the American Association of University Women of St. Lawrence County, the League of Women Voters of St. Lawrence County, and the Potsdam Public Library. Until next time, remember, our North Country matters. Sarah, thanks so much. That's a good conversation. Thank you.
Except for that